Hey there, this is Rish Outfield. In addition to narrating audiobooks, I have a podcast, a Star Wars podcast called the Star Wars Delusions of Grandeur podcast that I do with Marshal Latham. In the next episode, we're talking about this book, Twilight Company, written by Alexander Freed, a tie-in with Star Wars Battlefront, and I was very impressed with this book, very. And I thought I'd read an excerpt from it and post it on here. Again, I don't own this book or anything like that, but hopefully this acts as free advertising for this novel. It was written in 2015 by Alexander Freed. This is part of chapter 14, which takes place during the Battle of Hoth. Outpost Beta was the first sentry post destroyed, annihilated in half a dozen laser blasts fired from the mandible-like cannons of an Imperial walker. Namir saw flames through the macro binoculars, red and orange against white snow. As the walker trundled forward, the ground flashed blue under its footpads, proximity mines planted by Outpost Beta personnel, utterly impotent against the walker's mass. It should have been horrifying. And it was, in its way. The enemy outnumbered the rebels and had a massive technological advantage. According to Roja, none of the rebel ground artillery could penetrate the walker's armor. At best, precise targeted bursts might disable the machine's weapons, but the piston-driven crush of their feet would be no less lethal to organic targets. Yet, along with the horror, came a warmth inside Namir. He'd spent the last weeks without purpose, wandering a dusty metal labyrinth he hadn't yet escaped. Hoth might be a losing battle. It might be his death. But it was a battle he knew how to fight. The walkers were angling toward Echo Base's main power generators. Destroying the generators would bring down the energy shield. Without the shield, the base and any unlaunched transports were vulnerable to the Star Destroyers. Protect the generators was the order from above, and the priority of the rebel troops. Protect the generators. Hold out as long as possible. And when necessary, fall back. Outpost Delta was on the western edge of the walkers' projected path. There were possibilities there. If the walkers ignored the outpost's threat, Namir's troops might be able to flank the machines as they passed. He ran through scenarios as he watched his breath steam. Could there be chinks in the walker's armor, or on the sides or rear of the undercarriage? Could his squads act as spotters, or give covering fire for the rebel air support? "Sergeant!" One of the Echo soldiers, the woman who'd cheered for the transports, was waving him over. He trudged through the snow to her side. "What's going on?" "Command says snow speeders have engaged the walkers. No damage yet, but they're slowing down." Namir nodded, glanced into the northeast, and tried to make out the battle. He saw nothing except splotches of darkness on the horizon. The woman wasn't finished. "The bad news, sir, is that the Empire's sent recon forces fanning out. Troops are heading this way." Of course. The Empire's commanders weren't stupid. They wouldn't let anyone flank the walkers if they could avoid it. Namir wanted to call for the Delta troops to scatter, to let the turret and the trench and the artillery serve as bait while they hid and plotted an ambush. A straight-up fight against a superior force went against every instinct he had. "Get ready, then," he said, and swung down into the trench. Orders were to hold out as long as possible. He intended to do precisely that. The enemy scout force consisted of a pair of floating gunnery platforms and an AT-ST escort. Each platform carried half a dozen stormtroopers, wearing armor Namir hadn't seen before, stark white and almost invisible against the snow. They weren't skeletons. They were ghosts. And, he suspected, better equipped for the weather than he was. Let me give him a voice. "I want the turret and artillery focused on the platforms first," he said into his link. They'll want us aiming for the walker so they can ride in, offload the troops, and overrun us. Don't give them the chance." The Echo Base personnel didn't argue. Roja and Beak crouched in the trench. Namir checked his rifle, the A280 he'd been assigned with his cold weather uniform, the one he'd never used in combat before, and kept his eyes on the horizon. The plan lasted less than 10 seconds after the enemy came into firing range. As ordered, the turret gunners kept their weapons focused on one of the platforms, even as the ATST charged forward, kicking up snow with its spindly metal legs. The first platform went up in a fireball, its passengers caught in the blast. But the rebel artillery missed the second platform, shots going wide by 6 meters. That vehicle's stormtroopers leapt into the snow and dashed toward the outpost. Namir, Roja, and Beak fired at the ATST from their separate positions in the trench. Their goal was to distract the machine's pilot, to force the walker to re-target and give the turret a chance at a second shot. The walker was not distracted. It reared and fired on the turret, sending metal and ash and flames spattering across the ice. Namir was certain the 3 gunners inside died instantly, incinerated by plasma or crushed by the turret's walls. After that, the battle took on 2 fronts. Namir called out for Roja and Beak to stay in the trench and take aim at the charging stormtroopers. The surviving Echo Base troops stayed on the artillery, trying to lock onto the walker as it picked them off, one by one. Namir heard troops scream, saw flashes of red particle bolts, but he held his position, his chest pressed against the packed snow of the trench wall and his head and shoulders peeking above. At any time, he knew, the walker might select him as a target. But if the stormtroopers reached the trench, Namir and the others were dead anyway. So he gripped his rapidly overheating rifle in his cold hands, took aim, and fired at each stormtrooper in turn. He shot methodically, if not calmly, acquiring each new target as soon as he saw flames lick the armor of the last. When there were no more stormtroopers in his immediate firing arc, he spared another glance for his surroundings. The artillery stations were in ruins. The walker had, unexpectedly, crossed the trench and now stood on the south side. Something was attached to its leg, hanging like a piece of debris. Namir thought it was a scrap from the turret until he recognized the broken form of the woman who'd cheered for the transports, the woman who'd alerted Namir to the scouting party. She had one arm wrapped around the machine's ankle joint, her hand trapped in the gears. Her legs weren't moving, but somehow she was still alive. Her head was up, and Namir thought he saw her smile as she raised a grenade in her free hand. He wanted to call out to her as she disappeared in a fiery bloom and the walker plummeted forward, but he didn't know her name. He turned back to the north side of the trench. He saw the handful of stormtroopers still alive, cut down by Beak and Roja, the former still in the trench, the latter picking his way among the bodies on the ice. The second artillery platform had disappeared, presumably withdrawn back toward the AT-AT's path. The withdrawal didn't surprise Namir. Outpost Delta had lost its turret and most of its crew. It was no longer a threat to the invasion of Hoth. The rebel snow speeders were barely hindering the walkers. Not one AT-AT had been disabled by the time the fight at Outpost Delta finished, and the bulk of the Imperial forces had already progressed south, past the outpost, toward Echo Base. Delta's sole designated vehicle had been destroyed during the fighting, and its tauntauns had scattered, which left Namir, Roja, and Beak with a long walk home. As they marched atop a crust of frozen snow, the trio saw more rebel transports flash across the sky. If the base personnel could finish evacuating, Namir thought, the battle's losses might not be fatal to the Alliance. The 3 didn't talk much during the trek. Roja cradled his arm strangely, as if injured. Beak's shoulders were hunched, but his chin was up, the picture of grim determination. Namir scanned the horizon, trying to judge their distance from the walkers. The titanic machines were moving landmarks, and the farther south they plodded, the more unstoppable they appeared. About a kilometer from the outpost, the three found a wheeled Imperial combat transport, apparently abandoned in the snow. Broad scorch marks on its armored sides suggested it had been hit by cannon or snowspeeder fire. But when Roja climbed aboard, he had it working again in minutes. Namir didn't know where its passengers had gone, and he didn't especially care. It was a way to reach Echo Base before everything ended. Roja and Beak drove. Namir sat atop the hulking machine, grimacing at the painful lash of the wind as he studied the detritus of the walkers passing. He spotted crashed snowspeeders, bleeding black smoke, burning turrets and charred bodies at the other outlying sentry posts, cracked ice and depressions left by Durasteel walker footpads. The wheeled transport, Roja called it a juggernaut, raced over abandoned trenches with a sickening jolt, undeterred and unharmed. Twice, Namir called for a stop when he saw other rebel soldiers stranded on the ice plains. There was no time to halt for the dying, to check for survivors at every scene of destruction, but aiding those still walking was a compromise Namir could make. The Juggernaut's passengers numbered almost a dozen when an AT-AT walker finally went down. Namir couldn't see the cause. The falling walker was the size of a fist on the far horizon, but it seemed to stumble as snowspeeders flitted about its legs. Its joints bent forward, and then its whole body plunged headlong into the ice with a roar even Namir could hear. A low boom, less like a bomb than an avalanche. One of the rebels who'd joined Namir atop the transport grasped Namir's shoulders from behind and dug his fingers into the cloth of his jacket. "One blasted walker," the man said. To himself or to Namir wasn't sure. "If we can take down one, we can take down them all." Namir didn't agree, but he didn't correct the man. If it had been Twilight soldiers dying and evacuating, he might have uttered the same lie.